but give you an overview. So this is a Zoom session. We do record the session so that people who have signed up for the series who might not be able to tune in have the opportunity to review the session after the fact. But if you're uncomfortable having your face on, we understand if you want to have the camera turned off. We do have a significant following. Sometimes as many as 12 or 13 people might review one of the videos. So it's not mass production, but it's very important that we can sort of share this information. In terms of how the evening will go, for those of you who are tuning in for the first time this series, we will have a brief presentation from our speaker, and then we're going to genuinely engage in a discussion. So we encourage you to bring your questions, your ideas. We really do want to hear from you and hear what we think. This topic in particular seems sort of at the surface kind of very neutral and clinical, but when you start getting into it, it's actually quite provocative and contentious and very interesting and very important. So I do hope that we will hear your ideas. We ask that if you're not actively speaking, please keep your microphone muted because background noise makes the camera jump around all over the place. And that when you want to participate, if at all possible, I ask that you use the raise hand function. See how I have that up there? It's down in the reaction button. Just makes it easier for me to keep track of the queue. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Allison Hudgkins. And as I've said, I am the World Affairs Council of Maine's chief cook and bottle washer, also known as the executive director. And I am really privileged, and it's actually kind of a real delight to introduce my friend to you, Leila Bisharat, who I know from the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. She married very well. She married into the Bisharat clan, which is connected. I lived in Jordan for a long time, and so we have all kinds of connections with her husband, Suhail. But Leila is also an internationally recognized expert in the field of demography. She's got a PhD from Princeton University, but she's also worked all over the world in some very important positions. She I had this right here. For 25 years, she served as the Population Council's representative for West Asia, and then as UNICEF's Director of Planning and Coordination for all its programs and operations around the world. She ran the UNICEF office in Cairo, which was a regional office. She was able to somehow restructure that office from a human resource perspective, which, regardless of what she knows about demography, that in and of itself qualifies her as a miracle worker, as someone who has worked in Cairo. But she is, again, genuinely an expert on this, and we are really fortunate to have her as part of the World Affairs Council and willing to share her knowledge and experiences with you. So Leila, I'm going to turn things over to you. Thank you for being here this evening.
Well, thank you very much, Allison. It really is a treat for me to be here with all of you. So good evening, everyone. Those of you I can see, and those of you I can't see, I hope that I will get to know more of you as the evening goes on. I'm delighted to see that Susan was here, Susan Gilpin. I hope she hasn't disappeared already, because thank you, Susan, for the wonderful lunch you gave us after my Ollie presentation. There she is. Wonderful, Susan. And I hope you'll lead some of the contentious, perhaps, questions that may come up. Initiate them, because there's some tough things in this chapter that we have in the Great Decisions book that's just full of numbers, but yeah, some really interesting and perspectives on the way the world may be going. I'm taking the liberty, first of all, I'm sitting in my brother's garden on this fake screen. This is on Shebig Island, not that far from where Allison comes from on Cousins, and they think we cause lots of trouble over there on Cousins Island, right? But
They do.
Yeah, you give us a hard time also. But it's wonderful to be here in Maine, and I feel very privileged to be able to sit here, looking out to sea and sitting in my brother's garden. That all of us will be in green soon. And Susan, thanks for getting the Cardinals, you and Clifford, to perform when we had lunch at your house. As I look around whom I can see and whom I'm guessing I can't see, but I kind of think, Allison, you may be one of the youngest ones in the group. And forgive me if there's some wonderful 20, 30-year-old out there, please show yourself. But I'm going to be looking back a little bit at our own personal experiences of life first, before we get into this fortune-telling projections that we have before us. And speaking of fortune tellers, some of you may know of a wonderful book called Factfulness by Hans Rosling, who was a professor at the Karolinska Institute, who really understood it was very important to communicate numbers in an understandable way, and wrote this book called Factfulness and set up something called the Gapminder. But he says, beware of fortune tellers, look at them carefully, and always ask about the data. So I think we'll spend a little time looking behind some of the projections that we are seeing tonight and ask the kind of questions that you were asking last week with Clifford about climate change too. And I know quite a number of you are very knowledgeable, and I will love to have you speak up and take over. If we look back at our own lives, it is absolutely extraordinary the changes that we have experienced in our lifetimes. We have seen childhood diseases virtually disappear. Many of you probably had actually a scar from a smallpox vaccination. You had one, Allison? Wow, that puts you in our group. Don't find them anymore among younger people. Smallpox has been eradicated. But I had polio as a child very severely before the Salk vaccine. My parents were, one was a physicist, a scientist, the other was a university professor. And frankly, when I was in the hospital in a coma, all they could do was pray. There was an iron lung in my room that was covered with a sheet. The hospital staff would tell me when I was in the oxygen tent that that was a puppet theater. But I knew darn well that was no puppet theater. I had already learned to read, reading the names of friends of mine in the local paper who'd been stricken with polio. And I knew what happened when they had to shove you inside an iron lung and you looked up at that mirror. My brother and sister were quarantined. There were sheets on people's doors about what houses were in quarantine. We are on the verge of eliminating polio. There are very few hiding places of that wild virus that are left in the world. And think of all of the childhood diseases that mumps. We all had mumps and chickenpox and measles and German measles. And we're just talking about communicable diseases, but of course tetanus. All of us have taken tetanus shots for granted for a very long time. So whether it's the DPT, the pertussis tetanus trio, and other things that our grandchildren have come to take so for granted, there's been an enormous change in life expectancy, in child survival. Similarly, in childbearing, I bet we can look back in our own families at the number of children that our grandparents might have had as siblings, and ourselves. I remember, Allison, when I first went to take up my position in Jordan in 1970, the total fertility rate, that is, the number of children a woman might be expected to bear if she lived through her childbearing years, was 7.7. That is close to what we see as record highs. The United States might have had a total fertility rate of about 8, we're not sure, in 1800. But the world average of 1800 maybe about 6. And I bet you can't guess where Jordan's fertility is today. Allison? Even lower than 3.
No way. 2.5.
You're very close, 2.5, 3. It's not very much off what is looked upon as the world average, perhaps. Those are enormous changes in behavior and how people access health services. And please interrupt if there's a question. I'm not sure if I heard a question out there, but this is in the course of and even in my adult lifetime, I have witnessed this. Hunger, people living in poverty. The difference between 1960 and today is enormous. Maybe from 50% hungry about 1960 to maybe 9% today. That is living in poverty. But we've also experienced this digital revolution. I mean, I hardly experienced it on Shabbat because Allison will remember last year I was going crazy because I couldn't have a stable internet connection. We still don't have really reliable internet on Shabbat, but we're getting there to try to make these things work. But we've also been through the decoding of the DNA, the whole mapping of the human genome. And here we are in the age of CRISPR. And just imagine how vaccines were developed during the COVID pandemic with academics, individual researchers, university teams, private sector vying with each other to come up with a vaccine. And not just in the United States, global interaction as soon as that code was out for SARS-CoV-2. And using the knowledge to develop the mRNA vaccines that we have, many of us, the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines, others. So it's been an extraordinary period. And we all have lived through this, but we also have been living through the pandemic these past 2 years, experiencing changes that are profound in the way we live and very profound in human behaviors too. We might say we've seen the spread of the Western experience in what's called the demographic transition from high levels of mortality and fertility to low levels. I don't know if you can pull up that graph in the presentation, which I shared with you, Allison. It's a simple one that some of you have seen before, modeling that change from high levels of fertility. And well, that's the projection. We could have a look at that too. Yeah. This is a depiction of what someone named Frank Notestein who's gets credit for describing the demographic transition, although it was actually developed by some others before that. But you'll see from a stage 1 where death rates are high and fluctuating, and also where birth rates are high and fluctuating, but where population stays at a relatively stable low level. And then in that transition stage 2, when death rates fall and birth rate stays high but has an incipient decline, and that's when population growth really takes off. And the third stage, when mortality or child survival changes continue to happen, particularly child survival, moving to lower levels, and the birth rate comes down into this fourth stage where it is low, and sometimes that fourth stage is called the fertility trap, and we'll look at that later on, and mortality fluctuating. Thank you, Allison. I think we can take that off so we can see each other. But we have experienced that ourselves in our lifetime. That stage 2, certainly stage 3, our grandparents have probably described to us what stage 1 was like. But is this just a Western experience? Is this a Western model? As we look around the world, I cannot imagine that this has been imposed in a colonialistic manner on countries all around the world. There is a dynamic that is happening that we will look at a little more. Let's look back at the 60s too, and remember this was a period when there was a tremendous interest in this great population growth that was going on. And there was a fear too. And if Allison, you can bring up the film, it'll take us back to an era which we may well have forgotten. This is a retro report from the New York Times on the population bomb. Clifford put on a great film for us the last week on global warming. So I thought...
Are you ready for the film? Can you see the film?
Yeah, if you can start it and enlarge the screen, we can all see.
Week by week.
In the 1960s, a new kind of fear began.
So long predicted has stolen upon us. Overpopulation, so long predicted, has stolen upon us. It's getting worse week by week.
In the 1960s, a new kind of fear began to spread across America.
The U.S. could be busting out at the seams by the end of the century.
If we do not, by humane means, limit our numbers, then numbers are going to be limited by more famines and shortages and consequent social conflicts.
The idea that human population was outstripping the Earth's ability to support mankind was a powerful one. And in the hands of one man,
population growth will kill you stone cold dead.
The message reached a wider audience than ever before. But what became of the population bomb?
How many years do you have to not have the world end to decide it didn't end because that reason was wrong?
Stanford biologist Paul Ehrlich didn't start out as a prophet of doom. His area of study focused on butterflies. But after visiting the crowded streets of Delhi, he had a realization.
If we continue to let population grow, and if we continue to exploit the underdeveloped countries, if we continue to pollute the seas with a wide variety of compounds and so on, it's very difficult for me to picture things holding together for more than another decade or so.
The basic point is so simple. We have a finite planet with finite resources, and in such a system, you can't have infinite population growth.
Ehrlich laid out his hypothesis in a slim volume called The Population Bomb. It was a call to action for many, including a student Ehrlich advised, Stuart Brand.
There's too many people, and we'd like to see people have fewer children and better ones.
The whole idea that people make more people who make more people until there's too many people, and by then it's too late, that's a very persuasive argument.
Adrienne Germain, a young women's health advocate, found herself drawn to Ehrlich as well, due to his support of birth control.
The message was that we were already in a crisis, and if we didn't have urgent and immediate action, the world would simply destroy itself.
Look at what the year 2000 will be. Our cities are going to be choked with people. They're going to be choked with traffic. They're going to be choked with crime. They're going to be choked with pollution. And they will be impossible places in which to live.
Paul's picture of doom and gloom looked real.
Net world population is increasing by 23 people every 10 seconds. It's clear that world population growth remains completely out of control.
I bought it totally. Many of my friends bought it totally. I organized an event for 60 people to starve in public.
What are you trying to prove? It's about pain in the world. Maybe anybody who's thinking of having a third child ought to go hungry a week.
The mode became, don't have kids. There's enough of them in the world. And if your friends have kids, it's fine if they feel uncomfortable about that.
We had formed an organization called Zero Population Growth. And then Johnny took me on the Tonight Show.
Would you welcome Dr. Paul Ehrlich?
Have to get the death rate and birth rate in balance, and there's only two ways to do it. One is to bring the birth rate down, the other is to push the death rate up.
I did the show maybe 20 times, and we went from 6 chapters and 600 members to 600 chapters and 60,000 members.
We're starting in now. This is the first step. The Bagleys belong to a growing number of young marrieds who favor ZPG, zero population growth.
How many children do you have? 2. I have 2 children.
Ehrlich's views on how to bring the birth rate down were concrete. Compulsion if voluntary methods fail, creating a blacklist of people, companies, and organizations impeding population control in the U.S., responsibility prizes for childless marriages, a tax on children, and a luxury tax on diapers and cribs.
Concerns about population became misanthropic. And it was taken with so much seriousness that Paul Ehrlich could recommend things like putting stuff in public water that would make people not as fertile.
Panic is not too strong a word to use for some of the advocates that I referred to as true believers.
It was a zeitgeist that was taking shape.
Attention, all citizens. Childbearing is herewith forbidden.
One of the things about zeitgeist is they have astonishing durability.
It appears that large families are on the way out, and ZPG may be possible.
The idea also took hold in the developing world, where governments like India's had already begun to embrace population control.
The core message of the book, population growth outstripping food supply, resonated quite a bit with India's elites, with the middle classes. They much preferred to believe that the poor were poor because of too many children, rather than being poor because of an unfair and unequal economic system.
If you start with that problem definition, then it's almost inevitable that there will be circumstances where governments and other actors will act in a way that is coercive.
In the mid-1970s, the Indian government began a controversial effort to encourage mass sterilization.
We do want to create an atmosphere in which people realize the importance of this program.
It led to abuses. Access to food aid and housing were sometimes used as coercion. Others weren't even given a choice.
More than 8 million sterilizations were performed, many forcibly. The people, in the words of one family planning expert, were treated like cattle.
Several days ago, crowds formed to protest being sterilized. The police opened fire and killed at least 50 of them.
Zero population growth is a tragic frame in the sense that it was assumed that there was no way out, that people would just go on reproducing until there really was a desperate circumstance in the world.
Ehrlich's message could be summed up in a dramatic prediction.
Sometime in the next 15 years, the end will come. And by the end, I mean an utter breakdown of the capacity of the planet to support humanity.
Predictions do not necessarily come true. The critics go in and look at these little stories that won't come true. And when they didn't come true, say, Ehrlich was wrong. I was recently criticized because I had said many years ago that I would bet that England wouldn't exist in the year 2000. Well, England did exist in the year 2000, but that was only 14 years ago.
But Ehrlich says it could still be just a matter of time.
One of the things that people don't understand is that timing to an ecologist is very, very different from timing to an average person.
How many years do you have to not have the world end to decide whatever reason you thought the world was going to end, that actually maybe it didn't end because that reason was wrong?
Ehrlich predicted that by the 1970s, India would be starving. Quite to the contrary. The Green Revolution came to India with a big bang and a boom in such a rapid way that India has never looked back.
Although an estimated 3 million children around the world still die of malnutrition every year, the Green Revolution's farming technology helped lessen rates of hunger in the developing world over the decades, even as the world's population skyrocketed.
I know Paul Ehrlich reasonably well, and I respect him as a biologist. I don't and never have, and he knows it, agreed with his views on population. There's a tendency to apply to human beings the same sort of models that may apply for the insect world. The difference, of course, is that human beings are conscious beings, and we do all kinds of things to change our destiny.
Paul Ehrlich saw a density of people that frightened him. But with time, we've been able to look past the car window into what's actually going on with the demographics of the people who live there. And they're not having so many kids. And that's changed the whole story.
That story is playing out today in parts of India. In growing cities like Chennai in the south, large families, once needed for farming, are no longer always seen as the key to success.
Previously, my father used to have 4 children, and my grandfather used to have 7 children. But the things have changed. Even myself, I have only 2 children. Even my sister is having only 1 kid because now education becomes the first priority here.
Kamal Sharma takes time off from work to walk his 3 children home from school in the northern city of Patna, where he lives with his wife, Seema Devi.
मेरे लिए 3 बच्चे बहुत काफी है. मेरे हस्बैंड का सैलरी भी कम है.
Devi made her own choice to limit her family size, unlike in the 1970s, when some people were forcibly sterilized. Although the national policy has changed, pressure to meet unofficial sterilization targets remains in many areas of the country, and sometimes turns sterilization surgery into a dangerous assembly line.
We're told that 83 women were operated upon in a span of just 6 hours by a single doctor.
But increasingly, the government is finding that fertility rates can be reduced in other ways. For example, a prioritization of maternal health in clinics like this one in Medavakam has lowered infant mortality, making families more responsive to the government's message.
The population bomb was defused by urbanization, by people getting out of poverty all over the world, by having enough to eat so you didn't have multiple children in the hopes that some of them would survive. It's somewhat ironic that what Paul Ehrlich saw as a horrible, hellish vision of the future is what turned the population bomb upside down.
Brand says that Ehrlich did succeed in raising awareness about important issues, such as the destructive effect population growth can have on the environment, even if some of his predictions didn't come to pass.
If you ask me the question, are there things that I have written in the past that I wouldn't write today? The answer is certainly yes. I've expressed more certainty because I was trying to bring people to get something done.
But his core message remains the same today. There are nearly 4 billion more people in the world, and they are consuming more resources than ever before.
I do not think my language is too apocalyptic in the population bomb. My language would be even more apocalyptic today. The idea that every woman should have as many babies as she wants is, to me, exactly the same kind of idea as everybody ought to be permitted to throw as much of their garbage into their neighbor's backyard as they want.
But If the world were to succeed in its decades-old task to curb population growth, what then?
What if large population is not bad, but is good?
What many more countries are already trying to come to terms with is aging of the population.
Japan needs more women to have children. The fertility rate's low. The population is getting older and shrinking.
America's in the midst of a baby bust.
China is hoping for a new baby boom.
While certain population hotspots remain a concern, largely in areas with the scarcest resources, much of the world is now grappling with the flip side of the population bomb.
The point at which population peaks, around 9 billion in the 2040s or 50s, the story will not be, oh my God, we got 9 billion people, how horrible. It'll be, oh my God, we're running out of people.
Well, here we are. There we saw some newscasters we haven't thought about for years, didn't we? But two very different views. And Allison, you might put some questions out here. I in Clifford style, set up a few questions for us to be thinking about as we go ahead this evening. And the first one has to do with this central question we've been looking at right here. Is population growth causing global warming? The climate crisis is upon us. Global warming, we see it happening. Paul Ehrlich has no doubt whatsoever that his prediction of doom is upon us. Is that what we're seeing also with the COVID-19 pandemic? Changes that have happened? So my next question is, what about these changes that have been happening over the past few years? Would you like to read it out, Allison, or?
I'm trying to I had it on this screen, but then that screen ran away from me, which happens. But what I wanted to write, I think we should start with the first question. Actually, here they are. Sorry, right here. So the first question is population growth responsible for global warming? The second, how have changes during the COVID pandemic impacted or affected population growth? And what assumptions in these population forecasts should we question? So those are the three questions. And I think it would be great if we could start with the climate change question, particularly because last week's conversation was about climate change. And I think this connection between population growth and climate change is certainly something that we've been conditioned to take for granted. And it seems there's some truth there, but how much? I mean, what are people's thoughts on this? Don't everybody speak at once. Go ahead, Bill Hall.
and I just had to. So Leila, this is such a great topic. I absolutely love this topic. And I always thought that demographics is destiny. So this is really an interesting topic, and if I could find myself, which I sometimes have difficulty doing, to your first question, which is climate change, I think the answer is I'd love to hear other perspectives on it. Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that as population grows, there's more pressure on the climate, and there are more behaviors that might contribute to climate change. So that's true. But I think it's ameliorated or mitigated to some extent by the fact that or maybe I should say exacerbated, if population growth continues and consumption patterns that we in the West have created go along with that, then clearly it is going to pose a huge problem for climate change.
Right. Other views?
Other thoughts?
Yes,
Go
okay.
ahead. Bob Ashton, go ahead.
The question is whether we are going to truncate our lifestyle. Are we going to stop flying? Are we going to stop driving our cars? I'm sorry, Leslie, because you're a charming lady, but your presentation is, in my view, only partly complete. And if we can change our lifestyles, yes, we can panel more people. But I think the chance of doing that is almost zero.
Why do you say that, Bob?
A whole bunch of reasons. I can show you charts. I can show you, I wasn't prepared for this, but I have a couple of presentations by knowledgeable PhDs and that sort of thing of comparable background who predict all kinds of problems. I mean, climate change is substantially aggravating things like migration. We're worried about people coming across the Mexican border. Why are they coming across? Because the picture in the United States at the moment is so much better than where they came from. Not all of it, but part of that is climate change in Central America. That's true in Africa, it's true in the Middle East, and it's, I think, only likely to get worse.
Susan Payne?
Yeah, I'd like to just echo what Bill Hall said. I think climate change is contributing to, the population growth is contributing to climate change. But if you do look at the hockey stick that Michael Mann developed, looking at the increases in carbon emissions over time, the increase is going like that, and the population of the world is not going like that. So there's more to contribute to climate change than just the population increasing. And if you look at the per capita carbon emissions in a place like India or Africa, it's so much lower than here. So I agree that if everyone adopts our lifestyle, then we're really in trouble. And so I guess those are the things I'd like to say.
Karen? Whoops, you're muted, Karen. Whoop, you need to unmute.
There you are.
Sorry. But my thought too is, I'm not quite as pessimistic as Mr. Ashton, but I still think it's a yes, no. But to me, the more educated that we've become, the more hope there is, because just looking at all the changes that have happened in the US and, around the world, and the talks we've had about China and how they're working so well with the electric cars. So I still think there's some optimism because the rate has slowed of population growth and the more education of the population. And I wanted to say, hey, Leila, did you get to see the sunset? We're over here on Cousins Island, and it was just a beautiful sunset.
Yes, I was looking at it over the top of my computer.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
So thank you. That's my 2 cents.
I almost want to turn this question on its head and ask whether or not climate change is impacting population growth. Because I certainly know that I hear from people who are much younger than me, Gen Zs and younger millennials, why have kids? There's some genuine despair in terms of looking at climate change and questioning whether or not you want to bring children into a world that is doing what Susan said with the hockey stick there and the extreme weathers. And then, Bob rightly brought up you have migration, you have all of these pressures that are pushing people, perhaps also changing. It limits access to healthcare, but could potentially also be limiting or restricting population growth. What do you think about that, Leila?
Frankly, Bob, there's a lot that I agree with you about. Let's just look at that urbanization question. You probably recall, let's say in 1960, there were 2, what we call mega cities in the world. One was New York, with about 10 million, and the other one was where? Tokyo, right? That was it. And I know as a child, I thought New York was very exciting, but also a little scary, but very exciting. My mother had grown up in New York City, and she made me feel that it wasn't intimidating, and it was exciting. But we have now, what, 35 plus more mega cities in the world. And think of India with Mumbai as an example. Mumbai is on the seacoast. It sits in that peninsula, which the East India Company found so welcoming because it was well protected. But it is, what, maybe 23 million people. It has skyscrapers. It has some of the world's wealthiest people living in it, Indians. It also has some extreme poverty. It has the center of the media industry of India, filming, but it is sitting at sea level. These are huge, it's not just behavioral changes, these are huge long-term infrastructure investments that have been going on. And it is a city too with a very different kind of life as many of our mega cities in the developing world, Cairo and others, where you have shanty towns, yes, rapid changes in people's behaviors, but living in very difficult circumstances. What happens as seas rise there? Skyscrapers don't get taken down overnight. The demands of that infrastructure don't change overnight. The kinds of companies that have invested in that have a continued investment strategy for shoring things up rather than making major changes. So making rapid shifts in gears has a lot stacked against us, even I would say in countries where emissions are much lower than ours. Because as Gita Sen also pointed out in that interview with her, the upper classes, even the middle classes, like to think that it's not their problem. And Susan, I remember you had some great examples of who's creating the emissions last week when Clifford was talking. So there is a lot. The cities are hot places. There's a interesting young environmental engineer, Anu Ramaswamy, who is a great proponent of greening cities, of architecture that can change, of engineering that can change these mega cities into cooler places and more people-friendly places. Not surprisingly and encouragingly, she's an Indian who has become an American academic. There may be ways of doing things that are very different, but it takes a great deal of human behavioral change and economic systems changing to harness that.
I want to push back on you a little bit on this, Leila, though, because what you're talking about is urbanization. And urbanization could happen, is happening even with lower population growths or stable population growths, right? I mean, so I feel like we need to be more deliberate in our decoupling of problems that are contributing to climate change and population growth, because I'm not seeing a clear connection there. And I think Susan Payne has her hand up. And I thought, V, did you have your hand up? Yeah. So Susan, I'm going to let V go and then you can be next. Okay,
Yeah,
go ahead,
good.
V. V, you need to unmute. Can you unmute your button there?
Thanks.
There you go. Thank you.
I know that there have been some very creative projects in terms of dealing with cities that are at sea level. And I'm familiar with New Orleans after Katrina. And the waters had really destroyed a lot of houses, and there are a lot of interesting ways that you can raise houses. And I think dealing with that sort of change that's coming, even if we hope to mediate it somewhat, is going to make a big difference, so that we can tolerate a greater population if we use enough ingenuity, as we already have, and greatly increasing the amount that agriculture produces, for instance.
Mm-hmm. And those are two things that Gita pointed out that really change the equation. Human beings really being very conscious and seeking solutions, and then actually finding them and applying them. There's no doubt but what we have a concentration around the world of human beings living on the coastline everywhere, and it's going to increase. The questions are going to be, what are the solutions and what are the costs connected to that? But it doesn't get at the core of the problem, which are the greenhouse emissions. And yes, I see Susan.
Susan had her hand up.
Yeah, thanks. Yep. I wanted to get back to the newscast and challenge both Stuart Brand and Paul Ehrlich, and I am not as expert as they are, but just something for us to think about. One was when Stuart Brand said, well, someday we'll want more people than 9 billion, and this didn't happen, this terrible thing didn't happen by the deadline that Paul Ehrlich said it would. And I think we need to think about the idea of the carrying capacity of the earth. And that's something that comes up every once in a while. How many people, given our current level of resource consumption, can the earth really support? And if we think of everybody living at the Western style of life, we're already way past that in terms of number of people. So even though Paul Ehrlich's disaster didn't happen by the year 2000, I think we still need to take his cautions seriously. Mm-hmm. And then I also want to challenge him, because he was talking about coercive controls over fertility, and Al Gore in An Inconvenient Truth was talking about how to control fertility, and he said it's educating women, it's giving women contraception, it's giving women control over childbearing, it's giving people social security so they have support in their old age, it's lowering child mortality. So I think that that's why the demographic transition has happened, and we need to think about doing that. That helps everybody. We don't have to coerce people.
Yeah. I couldn't agree with you more, Susan. What we have seen in changes in childbearing pattern cannot be attributed to coercive methods. In fact, there is a great collection of evidence that the factors that you mention are exactly the important ones. The education of all, but especially the education of women and of girls, going to school, literacy, simply being able to read and write changes people's ways of behaving enormously. The power that a little girl can obtain when she is the one who is able to read the directions for everybody else in the family. The access to maternal and child health care services, and to be able to make decisions about using them. And, we are at a point in our country where so much has been available, but now the whole question of whether, in fact, people can avail themselves of family planning methods that we had come to take for granted. If there are two things that stand out in my mind, it is girls' education and it is access to reliable health services.
Well, aren't those those are the predictors, right? Those are the two things that if those things go up, fertility rate goes down, right? I think this was the conversation that we had about whether or not we could predict. And you were very clear that there were some things that we could use to make reasonable forecasts. I see a couple more hands up, Susan Gilpin and Bob Ashton. Susan, what would you like to contribute? You got to unmute yourself.
There we go. There's a lot said about how an aging population is a bad thing and that we need to have more younger people because, I don't know, these old people, they need an awful lot of services or something and we're kind of helpless. And so a population which is not growing is really a problem. I'm thinking, really? Is negative population growth really a problem? Is it a bad thing? Are we doomed to grow forever? That's what I'd like to know, Leila.
You know, frankly, Susan, I'm quite certain that we're not doomed to grow forever. And the prediction of that is behind some of the projections that in fact we will become an inverted age pyramid with a very teeny tiny base of young children and an enormous overriding top, that is the pyramid turned upside down, is one that really doesn't concern me a great deal. It might happen sooner than we think. There are not only the UN projections that we have in this chapter, but there are other projections that have been made by the Global Institute for Health Metrics at the University of Washington, another one center in Vienna. But perhaps as soon as the middle of this century, we will have a very different age distribution. We will have a shrinking population increase. And the numbers, even in the UN projections in this volume that we're using, the median projections are being questioned. That's why I say we'll put on our glasses to look at the fortune telling. As you move out over this century ahead of us, I think we're going to see quite different changes from what are being plotted in those curves. The difference between those curves is enormous, right? I don't know, Allison, if you want to bring up the UN projections.
I would like to, because this is, something that I would like us to get into in terms of the questioning the assumptions, where it's, really questionable if we're going to have the growth that we think we're going to have. But I have to find the right screen again.
It's got the colored.
Right, the one that has the different projections.
Yeah.
Go. Let me get to that, and let's see if I can get to the right. All right, I have to start over again. Bear with me a second, everybody.
And
yeah, go ahead. I think Bob Ashton had a question. Can you see this one? This is the one you want to look at, right?
Right.
Whoops, there we go. Yeah.
But as we look at it, Bill and Bob, I'd love to hear from you.
Go ahead, Bob Ashton.
Okay. I can't find it right now, but I could put together several things that I think this group would find most interesting. The bottom line is, there are very interesting technological answers to a lot of questions. Some of them are dead wrong. Some of them are right. I can show you a presentation that is very positive of nuclear power. the same presentation points out the expenses of wind and solar energy. The solar energy, for example, occupies an enormous amount of land, as opposed to, now some of the land can't be used for much of anything else, but some of it can. Some of the equipment going into wind generation in quantity is going to wind up after the 20 years or so with enormous piles of these huge blades that are going to be aggravating our pile of junk in our backyard. But the bottom line to me is there are a lot of things we can do. My concern is we aren't going to do it. I'm just afraid that with the political situations in this country and the concern around the world, it just isn't going to happen. Sorry, now I better go away. Shut up.
You've had your, aging population is fine, except for Bob Ashton, who is always in trouble with me, right? Always causing trouble. Bill Hall, only slightly less incorrigible than Bob Ashton.
And yes, I do appreciate Bob's comments very much. And Bob, I take probably a little more positive view of all this. And I think things are changing. And Leila, of course, I love your comments, and Susan too, about gray power, because I'm convinced gray power is the answer to everything. But realizing that prediction is a very hazardous business, there's a really interesting book out called Slow Down by Danny Dorling, D-O-R-L-I-N-G. And it's really interesting because it looks at a lot of these patterns of growth. And I'm looking at your chart right now, which is up on the screen. And if I said, Danny Dorling, where would he be? He's a social scientist. He would be on that green line that shows the population actually on a downward curve. And it's really a very interesting study. In study after study, again, I'm saying prediction is still hazardous, but again, he really does believe if he's looking at the world population, and not just in the advanced countries, but throughout the world, we're on a downward path. And I heard an interesting radio story yesterday about the US population, now at a lower than replacement birth rate, which is certainly interesting, with almost a trickle of immigration compared to what it used to be. Now, that's not a world population to show, it's just US. But with a very low immigration rate now and a less than birth rate replacement, our population is probably, in fact, for the last census, and I actually worked on the census for 2020, the population growth in the United States was the lowest it's ever been. So it's really interesting to see how this is happening. Maine, of course, as we all know, is an aging population, not growing very fast. Of course, I hear stories about people coming from other states to work here because they can work remotely. I don't know how much of that is actually happening. But when you have an aging population like this, as we've already mentioned, you've got to think about how you serve that kind of population and what impact that has. I have a son-in-law who's Japanese. And if you want to take a case study on what a country looks like when population has stopped growing, and Japan doesn't have a lot of inputs to new population, Japan is a fascinating story. It's an economy which, if you look at what the impact of this has been, economy that's still very successful with a very high per capita income, but an economy that has lost a lot of steam in innovation, because I'm still convinced innovation comes from young people, and is now having to figure out how things get accomplished without a large young workforce. How do you replace that workforce in terms of services for people and serving an economy, which again is very highly developed? And to a great degree, they've developed huge amount of automation in Japan we don't even have here. And they've also outsourced their manufacturing. Japan's a huge proportion of Japan's economy now is based on out of country manufacturing. which was not the case if I look back 30 or 40 years ago. So here's a great case study if you want to look at what happens when your demographic curve starts to change, how do you accommodate that? And Japan is a really interesting story.
Oh, okay. Well, Bill, I'm going to challenge you a little bit here by separating out two really important things, well, three of them that you've referred to. First of all, we lost somehow that graph there.
I can bring that back. Yeah.
The first part is on that lower curve, the one that is trending downwards there, which is not, by the way, used in our chapter in the Great Decisions book. It is the blue one that is being used, the median one that sees a growth to 11 billion at the end of the 21st century. The book uses the blue, the median projection. They produce very different results. 11 billion is some 3 billion more people than we have today. The lower one actually stabilizes below where we are today, slightly. But there are a number of studies that actually agree with the lower green curve. If you go to recent publication in The Lancet by the Institute of Global Health Metrics and Evaluation, led by Christopher Murray, you will see, and it's appeared in BBC and other places, strong arguments for that lower, similar arguments for that slowing down and in an incipient, declining global population. But I'd like to separate out from that the important reference that you gave to recent changes over the past period of the pandemic, in particular in terms of childbearing and US population growth, and especially immigration. We've been through a very interesting past few years when, in fact, doors in many ways were quite closed to immigration. But we also have, you remember at the beginning of people having to stay home, they said, oh, we're going to see suddenly a big baby boom here. That hasn't happened. In fact, yes, people have been staying home, but they haven't been having children. They have not been marrying often. And we see a rising percentage of young people who never intend to either marry or even if not to have to become involved in childbearing. So one question, of course, will that persist? There is a secular trend in that direction, but we're seeing an intense sort of preview of what might happen. We have, I understand, the Japan case is a wonderful example, and we have many countries in the world that are going through a similar dilemma. Not quite the powerhouses of Japan and its technological developments of the past, but stark drops in population that are predicted, many of them to be half by the year of 2100 of their present size. Now, think of an Italy, half its size. Think of Spain, half its size. Most of Western Europe, in fact, declining populations. But interestingly enough, one of the surprises is to look and find in the UN projections, that medium one at least, that the United States remains the only very populous country out of the industrialized or the Western world in the top 10 in the year 2100. And there's some surprises that we find in these projections. And Whether or not we agree, the UN Population Division and Joseph Shamy, who wrote the chapter in our book, has been the authoritative place for countries of the world to turn to ever since it was founded at the end of the Second World War. In fact, that fellow Frank Notestein, whom I mentioned with the demographic transition, was its very first director. It has continuous projections it produces with not only in-house, but uses a very outstanding set of advisors where they keep modifying the models that they use. But behind those models, one can ask the very important questions we're asking here. Yes, as you project them outwards, the uncertainty becomes very, very large.
The uncertainty is certainly large, but I keep coming back to this question of the drop off in population. And while I certainly agree that, the advances in healthcare and access to healthcare are extending sort of the lifespan of people in many, many ways. And so certainly having an aging population doesn't mean doom. But I'm also wondering if we're not paying enough attention to the possible implications, political implications and social implications of some of the decline. If we think about access, you use the word secular, Leila, and I guess I'll just go right into it and not beat around the bush. We're starting to see sort of a religious pushback that is very much aimed at the two things that we certainly know keep population rates in check, and that's women's education and women's fertility rights, right? I mean,
right. Or actually their ability to be able to make decisions about their own health.
Okay. Yes. Whoops. Do we want to keep this chart up or can we take this down?
Let's take it down so we can
see each other
yeah. Better.
Yeah. Because I think I'm missing Bob has his hand up and I'm missing that.
Good, Bob.
Yeah.
Jump right in.
Yeah.
Sorry to be such a problem here, but
to be a problem, I love it.
Population is only one factor. The key factor is, let's say, carbon.
Absolutely.
Let me point out that all these wonderful countries that got together in Scotland and came up with these great concepts, everyone in the agreement has said after the current administration is out of office, we have promised to be net zero by what, 2050? Biden won't be around in 2050. Neither will I. Neither will several people here. But nobody has agreed to what they're going to do today, tomorrow, this year. If you take the numbers, whatever number you want, representing the problems that are besetting the world, and extrapolate to this year, next year, 10 years from now, and see if anything is happening. It's not.
Well, I would like to be a little less pessimistic, and perhaps that's because I live on an island. And it is the biggest island in Casco Bay, but it is an island, and everything that happens here impacts someone else. We have a single aquifer. If one part of it has saltwater intrusion, it becomes a problem all around. If the dock gets submerged, it's a problem. It doesn't matter where you sit on the spectrum of political views, it's a shared problem. And the only way you can manage these issues is to roll up your sleeves and get together and do something about it. But I'm also very keenly aware of what it means, as Bill was pointing out, to live in an aging population. Can you guess what the median age of Shebig Island is? You guess?
60?
Almost there, yes, 59 plus, and you know, let's call it 60. Maine has the highest median age of any state in the United States. I think we have held that record for a long time. We have managed to flourish with it in many ways, but if you ride the boat from Shebig over to the mainland, you can sense the excitement when a 6-year-old gets on board. Everybody wants to chat with them. It's much more interesting. They're full of ideas. And if you ride the school boat going over to Yarmouth Middle School with the middle schoolers or the high school students, that's even more exciting. That's a secret boat because there might not be enough room on it, but people love to get on that boat because it's so much more interesting than all the other ones that are taking people in 60 plus to do shopping.
I don't know. I think you guys are all very interesting, but I keep wanting to push back on what I see happening in this conversation. You know, Bob Ashton is going on a tear about nothing happening. Well, something is happening. People are having fewer babies. As women's education goes up, fertility rates are going down. And we're in this conversation, we're talking about climate change, we're talking about the carrying capacity of the planet, and we're ignoring the disconnect between the other part of the conversation that we're having, which is we keep pointing to examples of the fact that the population is getting older because birth rates are declining. And I'm just so puzzled that this disconnect keeps happening. Climate change and I'm more convinced than ever that climate change and population are not as intertwined as we think they are.
Yeah. And nor are family formation patterns those that we knew before. If you go to our town meetings and hear the arguments against childcare of some, they say, well, I mean, let the grandmothers take care of them, let the parents, have a play group at home. No mother is staying home just to take care of her children. And the grandparents are working too, by the way. There has to be some kind of recognition that the world has changed. And even here where we can see it happening, it's of course, when it's connected to investing more in preschool or in facilities such as we have on Shebig for children from age 6 months or even 6 weeks, they will take them. It's, no, hands off. This is somebody else's problem.
And those are the exact conversations that are happening at the Yarmouth School Committee as we try to approve pre-K, the backlash. This is government taxpayer subsidized childcare. Women should stay home with their little ones. And I'm finding it really interesting that this blowback is becoming more aggressive. And it's, simply put, it's become extremely expensive. I mean, people are making choices about their fertility and having children based on things that are disconnected from climate change and all this other stuff. So Bill has his hand up. Go ahead, Leila.
If we look at the development of tiny children, of all of us, those synapses of the brain are connecting so rapidly within those first 2 years of life. We know there's no better investment than in early child care of the best sort that possibly can be managed because it pays off in multitudes of returns. And how you go about that. That is an investment no family, no society wants to neglect.
Bill, do you want to chime in?
I gotta say, I completely agree. Those little brains are absolutely amazing. I have a granddaughter who speaks 3 languages, and she learned them from the time she could first speak. She speaks Russian, English, and Kyrgyz. and she switches from one language to another depending on who she's talking to. So it's a remarkable thing. So, but it is interesting when you think about our aging population here in Maine and what our attitude is toward, and if I put this in the most grand possible context, population growth, it's really gotten to be somewhat negative. I think we've already said this, but I was on the Portland City Planning Board for 10 years, and getting enough housing in to accommodate people who wanted to live in Portland was a problem. Affordable housing, of course. But every time we would get a proposal for a development, the lines would form outside the hearing room, and the complaints would be from our relatively well-aged Maine population. My God, they'll bring in children. They'll bring in school children. We'll have to pay more for our schools. So it was here we are talking about population growth, and I feel like I'm trying to make almost a counter argument. But it is interesting in Maine, as the population ages, I do think there's less and less support for things like affordable housing, schools, things that we need to keep a vibrant and relatively younger population in our state. So that's an aspect of I guess you could say, population growth.
I know that there have been some other questions that have come into the chat box, Allison. I think a really important one, looking at where future growth is going to be in the world.
Yes, this one here, 90% of the future population growth will be in the poor world. And I think the charts that were in the briefing book, I think, showed that it was going to be Nigeria, it was going to be Tanzania, countries that are in the developing world, and where we're seeing large concentrations of population, primarily Africa. But you had some thoughts about that.
Yeah, well, it's a wonderful point. It's not just the poor world. It is, at least in the UN population estimates, it's sub-Saharan Africa, which is where 97% or so of the growth is expected to happen. And Nigeria becomes a powerhouse in those projections, at least in terms of population and labor force. But a question that I raise about it, and I know that's part of what goes into some of the alternative projections, is that we are seeing real evidence of birth per woman or total fertility rate declines in some of those African countries. Right now, like Niger looks the way Jordan did when I first visited. I mean, fertility rates of like 8, but you can see what is happening in Sudan, in Ethiopia, where it's been well documented that suddenly the decline begins to take off, and you modify some of those assumptions, and things could look quite different.
What about the impact of COVID-19? When we start talking about excess deaths and how severe is the pandemic going to be is it severe enough to impact population growth in its own right?
Well, certainly we know from evidence that's coming out from our own country, where we've suffered extreme losses during this 2-year period, that it has reduced the sort of that key measure of well-being, overall life expectancy of the population by over a year, maybe 1.1. We'll learn more. I wouldn't make any suggestion about what it may look like when finally the pandemic is declared over. We know we're not through that yet. But another very interesting thing that has been pointed out during our conversation is that childbearing has changed significantly during this period. And also we haven't had migration. Those variations in childbearing in the course of the 20th century, we know, were very sensitive to business cycles. After the Second World War, the baby boom, what we saw happening during the 46 to 50 period, and at other points, when things aren't good, people change what they're doing. When things get good, they may vary again, but it's at a relatively low level, say from 3.3 to 3.1, but we're seeing changes that begin to dip below what we call replacement level. That's below 2.1. Will this persist? That's the big question mark. Is this an aberration? And we'll forget about it and go back to living our lives as before? We'll see.
Karen?
Yes, just I wonder if we keep numbers on immigration to Maine specifically. It strikes me over the last 15, 20 years that we've had a lot of folks from away come to Yarmouth in that area. Has this really affected our population? Has it affected the birth rate? Or we have numbers?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's not just in the U.S. If you look at Sweden, for example, where they were trying very hard to raise the childbearing levels of the population, and they thought they'd made a real difference with a lot of incentives. It turned out that, in fact, it was due to change in migration, that the childbearing patterns of new people who settled were making up the difference, that it was not government incentives to the Swedes. There has been, and I am not an authority on immigration into Maine or asylum seekers and refugees, but there are numbers coming out that show a significant impact of people settling here, as they say, from away. And we can see it in, a Hannaford grocery store or grocery stores, and they've become a lot more interesting in many ways. Items that never would have been in a main store are just normal part of supermarket shopping today.
I can certainly say, coming back after 20 years abroad and finding that you could buy grape leaves and za'atar in the Yarmouth Hannaford was a bit of a shock there.
They've beaten out, salted cod, right?
Right, exactly. But I will, just one tidbit of information. I was looking up the percentage of the population in Maine that is non-US born, and I think it was around 6 or 7%. But what was really interesting in that figure is that Maine actually has one of the lowest proportions of native born, lowest percentage of non-native born Americans of any state in the Union.
Right.
Yeah.
And we also
catching up too. Yeah.
We also held that distinction before.
Yeah.
There's no doubt in my mind that the world ahead of us is going to be one where nations that keep their borders open in various ways and compete for migrants are the ones that are going to succeed. The UN population projections do in their modeling include increase in migration, and looking at some of those factors. But that is one of the big questions. How successful is a country going to be in the world where inducing new people to join in is going to be a determining factor of how well you do.
Well, we are just about time, and I know that Bill Hall has his hand up, and I'm going to give him the floor because he's coming next week. But I also want to thank Leila for her expertise, and for all of you here for your contributions and your questions and your engagement in this issue. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here. Bill, you're doing industrial policy.
I know. Can you imagine a sexier title? Come on. How did I get this?
Yes, yes. Do you want to close us out, Bill?
I would love to close it out. First, I want to say thank you to Leila for a very interesting evening, and everyone who participated, but also your concluding remarks are right on. I absolutely believe that's true, Leila. And I think, I really do believe demographics is destiny. And I think that's kind of the comment you made. And if we're looking at local conditions, we have a ways to go in Maine.
Yeah,
we are growing in population, but it's at about half the national level. So, it's a challenge for the state. But anyway, next week we're going to do as since Allison has allowed me to advertise. I think this is great. Thank you, Allison. But we're going to talk about industrial policy, which I think you'll find absolutely fascinating. I can't imagine you wouldn't. But also, I'm going to add a little boost to that, and that is it the end of globalization? So I'm going to leave that hanging, and hopefully you'll be so fascinated by my addendum that you will come.
Well, it's been a great treat to be with all of you this evening, and you can count me in next week, Bill, on industrial policy.
So thank you, everyone, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your evening. Bob, Ashton, you'll have to keep your question for next week.
I talk too much anyway.
All right. Have a lovely evening, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, Allison.
Tonight. We'll see you
next
night,
everyone.
Good night.